Welcome everybody to this webinar on our recent report, System Level Impacts of 24/7 Carbon-Free Electricity Procurement in Europe. This is work done by my colleague, Dr. Igor Repin, and myself. Just a few words on the format before we get going. I'm going to give a presentation of the results for 20-25 minutes. Then we'll have 3 respondents make comments on the report and relate it to their work in their respective domains. So we have joining us today Nicholas Bernardi, representing or from Energinet and representing ENTSO-E. We have Remco Fast from Eneco and Bruce Douglas from Eurelectric. So you can ask questions in the Q&A. If you put your questions there, then we'll answer them probably directly after my presentation. I'll take a few quick questions, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for discussion with our panelists and with you, the audience, through the questions that you ask. Unfortunately, we had also planned to have Katrin Fuhrmann today from ENGIE, but she wasn't able to make it. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube later. Okay, great. So I'll get into the presentation about our report. Just a few words of acknowledgement to start with. We'd like to thank Google for funding this work through their grant to us, and also for all of their feedback from their policy team on the report and on the initial results. We're also relying a lot on open source software for the analysis, so we shout out to all the teams who maintain the software. Okay, so I'll give you a quick introduction about what the report is about, where we're coming from, and then we'll go into the methodology behind the report and some of the results. So as many of you know, many companies at the moment are trying to meet their electricity demand using renewable energy sources, but they're typically doing that on an annual basis using either unbundled certificates or directly procured power purchase agreements, or PPAs. And there are already around 370 companies signed up to reach this goal in the RE100 group. But this is not necessarily good enough if we want to decarbonize our supply. Here's an example of 100% renewable energy matching where we're not actually fulfilling the decarbonization of our demand. So what you see here is a 2-week period in January where we have our demand in gray in the background, and we have actually matched that with renewable energy, wind in this case, over the 2-week period, but we still have lots of periods of oversupply and periods of deficit where we're not actually meeting our demand with clean energy. These problems of deficit are particularly problematic because we have to rely on the rest of the system to provide electricity during those times to fill those gaps, and that may be relying on fossil-fueled electricity with high emissions, and that puts us also at price risk because we have to go back to the market to buy electricity during those hours. This is, of course, the best case where we have real additionality through a PPA, and we actually have the procurement inside the same bidding zone. That isn't necessarily always the case with people trying to fulfill their Scope 2 emissions, Scope 2 requirements with renewable energy. So you could have a PPA in Spain and your main demand in Germany, for example. So this is the best case, and we have a problem with our matching. What you also see from this example is the difficulty, not just with the hourly matching, but these longer periods where we don't have renewable supply. So we have a multi-day period here where we don't have any wind and where we won't have much solar, and that's actually quite hard to bridge with something like batteries. And this is one of the phenomena that really drives the costs of getting to a truly decarbonized system. So the idea behind 24/7 carbon-free energy is to correct this problem by really going to carbon-free energy on an hourly basis. That's the topic of the study that we've done. We've compared this 100% matching on only an annual basis to true hourly 24/7 carbon-free procurement in a selection of European countries. So we look in 4 cases at Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, and we look into the year 2025 and 2030 in a computer model of the future system. And we want to find out, how do we actually reach these hourly targets? What kind of technology mix do we use? What's the cost premium of doing so? Because we may need additional technologies, and what are those likely to cost? We'll look in particular at advanced technologies like long duration storage and new dispatchable clean technologies and how they can help. And what we particularly want to see is the system impacts. So what happens when a large amount of the corporate demand actually follows these 24/7 principles, how this affects the rest of the system in terms of the system's emissions and in terms of the flexibility requirements in the system. So I'll just run you through the methodology that we're using here. We're using a power system model of the full European system. So you see here all the major countries represented. with 1 node per bidding zone for those major Central European countries. And we're using a capacity expansion model where we look into the future. If we add capacity to reach 2025 and 2030 targets, what that system might look like in the future. This is implemented in our open source model, PIPESA, and the European version of that, PIPESA Europe-SEC. All the code is available online along with the data, so you can download it and run it yourself. We'll look at consumers following 24/7 approach in these 4 zones that we just mentioned. And in particular, because we're looking at the system impact effects, we're going to aggregate the consumers into a single profile to meet their 24/7 supply. So we're looking in an aggregated way to analyze the system effects, whereas in reality, we could have individual customers with individual profiles trading, for example, hourly granular certificates to meet that profile. But for this study, we're actually going to aggregate everything together so we can examine the system impacts. So how do we actually measure whether it's really hourly carbon free? Well, we need to go and collect statistics on what's going on an hourly basis. And we say in a particular hour that generation is carbon free if our directly contracted assets are delivering carbon free generation. So you can see that here in the blue case is our directly contracted asset in this graphic from Google. And if it's fully fulfilling our demand in that hour, then that counts as a fully clean hour. We don't count any excess because that excess isn't contributing to our own consumption. We can also allow energy taken from the grid, so imported from the rest of the system, to contribute towards our CFE score. So if at the moment there's a lot of wind or a lot of hydropower or a lot of nuclear generation, that can also contribute to our score depending on the mix of the system. So you can see here in the left-hand example, a mix with some amount of fossil fuel generation and some amount of clean generation, and whatever fraction is there contributes towards our score. In the middle case, you see a mixed case where we have some contracted power and some power taken from the grid. So we can actually have fractions of the hour met by clean energy, and we take basically the average over the full year, what the typical hour would have in terms of its coverage. So if we have 100% clean system all the time, then we'll reach a score of 100%. But if in some hours we have some dirty fossil fuel generation being imported from the grid, then that will reduce our hourly CFE score. So that's how we measure it. In practice, in the code, we're implementing a methodology by the Princeton group around Jesse Jenkins, who published a similar report for the US last year. So we allow different technologies to meet this supply. So in terms of the directly contracted energy, we look at different selections of technologies depending on their maturity and their availability. So we group them into different palettes, so that the very basic palette is those technologies which are commercially available today, so onshore wind, solar, and batteries. Then we look at a second palette where we add to that long duration energy storage, in this case in the form of chemical storage, in the form of hydrogen. And then we look at a third palette where we also allow dispatchable clean generators. In this case, an Allen cycle with CCS, that's combusting natural gas, and an oxy-fuel generator with relatively high marginal costs. And we also have an advanced dispatchable generator representing our rather more capital-intensive advanced geothermal or advanced nuclear. So that would be something like closed-loop advanced geothermal that can be built anywhere, or advanced nuclear systems like small modular reactors. So those technologies are sort of indicative of what might be in the market in the future. And we can see then how the system changes as we change the technology mix. So there's actually a lot of scenarios that we compute in the report. We have a range looking at 9 different procurement strategies. So we look purely when we take electricity from the grid, when we have 100% renewable energy matching on an annual basis, and then when we have different 24/7 hourly CFE targets ranging from 80% all the way up to 100%. We do that in 4 different bidding zones in Ireland, Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, West. We have our 3 different technology palettes representing different levels of technology availability from today's technologies up until what we might expect in the future. And we look at 2 future years, 2025 and 2030. The choice of the year affects the technology costs, the available technologies, the national renewable energy targets, what power plant fleet is still there in terms of legacy fleet that might have been retired, the CO2 prices and the fuel prices. And in the report, you can find a few other sensitivity analyses looking at the shape of the profile and the amount of the commercial and industrial demand that actually follows this 24/7 strategy. So there's over 200 scenarios that we consider. What I'm going to show you now is some of the results. It's not all of the results, but it gives you a bit of a feel for what the results look like. So here's our first graphic, and this shows you for different procurement strategies how we score them on the basis of their hourly CFE rating. So on the y-axis here, we have the fraction of the supply that's genuinely carbon-free, going from 0 up to 100%. So that's the y-axis. And the reference case, where we just take electricity, is this dashed line in the middle. And if we're relying, in this case in Ireland in 2025, on the background grid, then we reach a CFE score of 61%. So it's already a relatively clean system. Now, if we take the extra step of matching on an annual basis our demand with 100% renewable energy, that's the left-hand bar here, then we can raise our CFE score because we're procuring extra wind and solar. We have, of course, met our demand with our directly contracted electricity here in purple, and we also have to fill in those gaps where the renewables aren't generating with imports from the grid, and some of that will be clean. So we also get a contribution from what we take from the grid that happens to be carbon free. The rest here is then electricity imported from the grid that isn't actually carbon free. So that's our carbon generation. So with 100% renewable matching in Ireland in 2025, we're actually already reaching 85% carbon-free energy on an hourly basis. And what we do in the remaining bars here is we actually set a CFE target going from 80% all the way up to 100%, and that will increase the level because we've added that as a constraint on the system. And you see here we go from 80% total hourly CFE all the way up to 100%. And as we crank that up, we're reaching higher hourly CFE scores than we get with the annual matching, up to 90, 95, and 100. And you see that the higher the CFE score, the more we have to rely on our directly contracted resources because the grid itself is not totally clean. So we kind of can't rely on the grid anymore because relying on the grid means also taking fossil fuels into the mix. So as we get towards 100%, we really have to do the clean carbon-free energy ourselves. So that's the view from our scoring of our different strategies. If we look at actually the emissions rate of the consumed electricity, then we also see that basically cranking up the CFE target reduces our emissions down to 0. Well, why does that happen? Well, if we do this 100% annual matching, we still need to fill our demand with imports from the grid when the renewables aren't producing, and that may have fossil fuel generation inside, and that contributes here to the average emission score that we get when we go for 100% renewable matching. You see it's already an improvement compared to taking from the grid, but if we really want to properly reduce the emissions attributed to our electricity consumption, we need the CFE target all the way down to 100%. So taking this hourly CFE approach actually reduces our emissions all the way down to 0. This is, of course, for our direct emissions, not including all the LCA of producing the plants and so on. So what actually is the technology mix the model is using to meet these targets? Well, if we're looking at palette 1, which includes existing technologies of onshore wind and solar, then we're seeing basically much higher necessity of procurement the closer we get to 100%. So we need more and more capacity because we're trying to bridge those difficult periods with a combination of renewables and storage, batteries here in this case. And the model can only do that by really overbuilding the wind and solar, as you see here. So solar is yellow, wind is blue, and the battery here are in gray. So we can get up to a score of 90 to 95% simply by adding solar and wind to the system with some storage. But if we want to go all the way to 100, we really have to overbuild. And that's largely being driven by those difficult multi-day periods when we don't have that much sun and wind, so-called Dunkelflauten in German, that drive this extra procurement. So that's what it looks like from the capacity side. If we look at the costs for directly procuring that wind, solar, and batteries, this diagram shows us what the total costs are when we take all of the costs of our directly procured electricity and any imports we need from the grid, and we divide that by the total generation. This is something like a breakdown of an ENTSO-E for the provision of this carbon-free electricity. So you see here again, on the left-hand side, we have our 100% annual matching, and then the costs are increasing as we meet those hourly CFE targets. You'll notice here we're talking about net costs because we're including both the electricity purchases in green that we need to meet our demand with this supply, and we're also subtracting any revenue we get by selling excess electricity to the grid. So we're getting a net cost here, and that's given by these small black bars. And you see here, there's not very much cost premium going up to 90 or 95% compared to 100% annual matching. We're talking a cost premium of 10 to 20%. But if you really want to go up to 100% with this limited selection of technologies, then you're really doubling the cost, particularly for that last 2% as we're decarbonizing those dark wind lulls. So what does it look like if we broaden the technology portfolio? Well, if we include, for example, long duration energy storage into the mix, here that's represented by hydrogen storage. So we're using electricity to electrolyze water to give us hydrogen, storing that underground and then re-electrifying it in a fuel cell in this example. Then the situation looks much better. We have a much smaller capacity portfolio to meet our demand with hourly CFE, and we've also dampened this cost increase as we get to 100%. So that long duration energy storage is offering us the ability to bridge those difficult periods, and we now have a cost premium of around 50% compared to the annual renewable energy matching. If we go further and add to the palette dispatchable technologies, here in this case our natural gas alum cycle with carbon capture and sequestration, or our advanced geothermal technologies like closed loop geothermal or nuclear, this further limits the hourly CFE cost premium above annual renewable energy matching. So you can see here that our total portfolio of capacity is actually lower than 100% renewable energy because we're getting much higher capacity factors with our dispatchable generator, here the alum cycle, and you see the alum cycle itself is actually coming to dominate the costs as we get closer to 100%. So this shows you the benefit of adding dispatchable generators to the mix when we're trying to reach these hourly targets. Here the cost premium is something more like 20 to 30% of going all the way to 100% hourly matching. But it relies on these technologies which are not widely commercially available at the moment. So I've shown you the studies from the buyer's side. How does this look like from the system side? What we can do is we can actually measure the system emissions in Ireland, so inside the local bidding zone, and see how they behave when we have more hourly matching. So in this case, if we compare the system emissions when we have 10% of the commercial and industrial demand, that's 10% by electricity demand, following these procurement patterns, we can compare the system emissions with 100% renewable matching, here giving around 2.9 megatons of CO2 in the Irish system versus 100% hourly matching, and that reduced the emissions here by 0.2 million tons of CO2 in the Irish system. So we do actually have an effect on the total system emissions by more buyers moving to an hourly approach. Why does that happen? Well, it's partly because the most economical way of meeting these hourly targets is to have a little bit of oversupply, overgeneration above the demand, and that contributes towards the decarbonization. The other effect is that we have now clean energy feeding in throughout the year, including in those times when we don't have wind and solar. And when we're feeding in then, we're displacing this fossil generation. So if you think back to our 2-week example, we had those gaps where there wasn't any wind generation and we were relying on the fossil fuels. Well, now we actually have supply for our hourly CFE targets that's pushing out that fossil generation. And that contributes to reducing the system emissions. So not just the emissions of the buyer. How does this look when we go to the other countries? So I mentioned we did 4 countries and we did 2030 as well. Well, broadly speaking, the results are quite similar. There are some differences between the countries. I'll show you a few examples now because every country has its unique set of characteristics that depend on local resources, renewable availability, the existing power fleet, and the national policies. When we go from 2025 to 2030, that also changes the picture a little bit because we have sinking technology costs, particularly the costs of storage and advanced dispatchable generators. These newer technologies we expect to become cheaper over time. We also have an effect that the background system is becoming cleaner because of those national policies. And overall, the contribution of these things is basically to make reaching these hourly targets easier and cheaper in 2030 than it would be in 2025. We also have a stronger effect from this timing, this profile effect in terms of the system emissions. This is a slightly subtle point, but when the rest of the grid is decarbonizing, you have more of a contribution from this timing effect of the hourly CFE than this volume effect that we mentioned earlier. So let's show a few examples. If you're interested in more details, you can have a look into the report. Here's an example when we switch Ireland now for Germany in 2025 with our palette 3, where we have different technologies. And what you see here is that rather than choosing the high variable cost Allen cycle, we have here instead the system preferring these more capital intensive advanced dispatchable generators where we don't have that many most variable costs and everything is in the fixed costs. And this is preferred in the German system because the German system is very central and very interconnected, and that tends to basically benefit low marginal cost generators. So we see those being preferred in the German system, unlike the Irish system, which is an island. Just to give you an example of the differences between the countries. Here's another example where we go to another extreme where we have Denmark in 2030 with a relatively clean background system because we're implementing the NECP, the Danish national target of 110% renewable electricity in 2030. So this makes the system very clean. So already in the reference case, when we take grid electricity, we have a 93% hourly CFE score, which is pretty good. And we actually see more of the grid playing a role in the CFE score of the procurement when we go to these hourly CFE targets. There's more green on the left-hand diagram where we're scoring the CFE. On the right-hand side, you can also see that grid procured electricity providing a lot of the demand, and we only actually see dispatchable technologies in this case playing a role when we go right up to 100% CFE, so we have completely decarbonized electricity supply. So we also have an effect on the system, not just in terms of the emissions, but also in terms of the flexibility requirements. Flexibility requirements here we're classifying as the amount of storage and peaker capacity we need in the background system. So what this graph is showing us is for Ireland on the left-hand side and Germany on the right-hand side, the changes in system capacity as we go for the different procurement strategies. So overall, the more procurement we have, the more wind and solar we have. But if you look in the details of our flexibility technologies, so our storage battery technologies and our peaker gas open cycle turbines, then we see a bigger reduction, so a negative system capacity change for our batteries when we go to 100% hourly CFE matching. And if we look in the German case, we have a reduction in the amount of gas peaker capacity required because the more CNE we have following an hourly strategy, the less backup capacity we need in the bulk system. So this is the benefit for the flexibility. Generally, we see that the more extra technologies we have, the lower the cost premium, but also in 2030, we also generally have lower cost premiums for getting to 98 or 100%. So this is just a table of the results, which you can look at in the report. I see we're running a bit short on time, so I'll just wrap up now. So the main results, the main takeaways from this report is that following an hourly 24/7 carbon-free energy procurement strategy leads to lower emissions both for the buyer and for the overall system, as well as reducing the flexibility requirements in the system. So there's benefits both for the buyer and for the system. If we look at the cost premium, reaching 90 to 95% hourly CFE can be done at a relatively small cost premium using existing technologies like wind, solar, and batteries. Going beyond that level will require new technologies to reach that in a cost-effective way. So we see rapidly increasing costs above 95%. And if we have long-duration energy storage or clean dispatchable technologies like advanced geothermal or nuclear, then we can limit that cost escalation. What's also a big benefit of this 24/7 approach is it sends the right signals to the market about needing hourly signals to decarbonize. So rather than just stuffing wind and solar into the system, where they're just simply producing regardless of the correct time or the correct place, we're actually creating market signals to encourage new technologies into the market. And by creating these early markets, we can stimulate innovation, stimulate capacity deployment and learning that benefits the whole system in the long run. Because as the whole system decarbonizes towards 2035 and 2040, we're going to need these technologies. And this provides an early market. So we're thinking very much in terms of the solar picture, where solar was scaled up thanks to big deployment pushes across the world in Japan, in Germany, and China, and this big demand pool pulled in all this capacity, which led to decreasing costs over time. And it's exactly the picture we want to think about when we're thinking about these new technologies. Just as a little outlook, the project is continuing, so we're very happy to have feedback. We're going to run the project until March of 2024. We'll be looking at a bit more detail at demand-side management, both in time and also between Google's data centers. We'll have a look more at some more details of the uncertainties regarding price developments for carbon dioxide and also for our various fuels. And we'll also be looking a bit more at the grid impacts. So that just gives you a little bit of an outlook, and that's the end of the presentation. I think we have a little bit of time to address some of the questions in the chat. So I'll just have a quick look there at the first question, and then we'll open up the floor to our respondents. Yeah, so somebody's asking about the residual grid mix. So here we're not distinguishing in these results between the grid mix that could already be spoken for in terms of certificates and the other parts of the clean grid mix that could be coming from state subsidized renewables, for example. So I think one thing we can do in the future is make that distinction a little bit clearer. At the moment, for example, the volumes of the PPAs in the German system, for example, are not big enough for that to be a large effect, but that could be having an effect as we go forward. That's a particular issue with the simulation here. In the real world, when we would be implementing this, we would ideally be implementing this with hourly granular certificates, so we wouldn't get any double counting like that from the other contracted and spoken for clean energy in the mix. Somebody asks about the heat sector. We did not consider the heat sector in this work. This is entirely focused on the power sector. We have other reports that do look at the full sector coupled system, which I encourage you to have a look at there. But for this study, we're just focusing on the power system. I also saw a few questions in the chat. Somebody shared the link to the code. Thank you very much. Somebody asked about carbon removal. What is the best choice for this technology in the near future system? We did not consider carbon removal in the system. We only considered technologies with really no direct emissions. We didn't consider the possibility to compensate unabated emissions with carbon removal. I'm a bit skeptical about whether that really would be competitive. We'd have to look at that, having unabated emissions with carbon removal. I think that would be more costly than catching at the point source like we do with the Allen cycle, for example. Killian Daly from Energy Tag points out this presents the very best case where 100% renewable energy matching is local and with PPAs. But as he rightly points out, there's a lot of procurement done that's not locationally matched and with unbundled GOs, guarantees of origin. So in that case, it would look very, very unfavorable compared to this 100% hourly matched local and additional CFE. So that would be basically catastrophic compared to the hourly matching, to answer that question. Okay, I think I've answered all the questions I can see. So I'd now like to hand over to our respondents who've very kindly given their time to make a few comments on the report and relate it to their own work. So as the first person, I'd like to invite Nicolas Bernardi from Energinet, representing ENTSO-E, to make a few comments. Remco, Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Have to quickly unmute. Yes, thank you very much. My name is Nicolas, and I'm a business developer at Energinet Data Hub. And yeah, we're currently working on a solution which actually should make granular certificates and also matching consumption and production possible. And we also entered a an international collaboration between 3 TSOs, which are Energinet, Elia Group, and Elering from Estonia. And in energy tracking trace, we try to work towards more alignment on how granular certificates should work in Europe, because what is very interesting are, of course, your results and what you're showing. So granular certificates and hourly matching actually makes sense in terms of decarbonization and also in terms of more flexibility and also having battery storage and other technologies entering the market. But at the same time, we have to figure out how to, on the one side, build these systems, and on the other side, how to drive legislation, how to drive standardization, and so on and so forth. Because what we also can see is that the demand currently is especially on big corporates that work internationally, and they of course would like to have a solution which kind of works in the same way like in the entire European Union. So this is pretty much what we are trying to drive here. And when building these systems, you also very soon enter a field where you have to figure out how to scale these solutions. We're talking about a lot of data that has to be handled, and we also talk about how can we actually send granular certificates back and forth between different registers. So what we're currently focusing at is developing a system as a distributed network where we have different registers holding these granular certificates, but which then are interconnected between countries, and where it is possible to send granular certificates back and forth, and also do the matching back and forth. And of course, if we are then going on this way, we also talk about interconnectors, because if you're looking at all this locally, this makes a lot of sense, especially when the grids are very interconnected. But if you look at these solutions having some very remote renewable energy facilities, and you probably have bottlenecks in the grid, then the granular certificates are a nice feature, but it actually doesn't really help a lot on green transition or decarbonization. So these are all also factors that we will have to look at, and which probably also could be interesting in terms of future modeling. And then a last remark, which I also already sent to you by mail beforehand, but which probably also is interesting for the audience, is rather than looking at these very advanced storage technologies such as batteries or geothermal, we could also take more low-hanging fruits and look at flexible capacity in terms of biogas or biomethane. In Denmark, at least, we already have a share of 30% biomethane in the grid. So if we could use biomethane as a flexible energy carrier, which is actually renewable, then we could probably fill the gaps and also bring down costs for granular certificates and for 100% renewable 24/7 matching.
Thanks, Nicholas. I completely agree on that point, and I think as long as the biomethane's meeting sort of additionality criteria, that we're really bringing additional plant to the system, and we're also meeting sustainability requirements, that we're focusing on wastes and residues, I think that's totally valid to be included. I had a quick question back to you based on the comment. This issue of trading certificates between different bidding zones, what challenges do you see there, and do you have some of the solutions for that?
Yeah, well, we don't really have the real solution yet, but when I look at bidding zones, at least in Europe, then one thing becomes clear. Often it's actually country boundaries or country borders which actually define the bidding zones, and then it's not always the case that these bidding zones are very good interconnected. So when talking about cross bidding zone trading of granular certificates, it would actually make sense to look at areas which are very good interconnected, and then look at the areas that are not good interconnected. So one example could be, for example, looking at the Netherlands and Germany. There we have an area where it is very good interconnected. So you could actually just, in terms of trading granular certificates, you just could probably put them together and say like you're free to trade here. Whereas if you look at, I don't know, Denmark and Spain, for example, these two bidding zones are not very good interconnected. So here it is very difficult to do some trading, which in the end makes sense. And so that would actually be the optimal case. And then it's always like that you don't really get the optimal case when you try to put things into reality. So what we're trying to look at currently are 3 different solutions that we would like to test actually, and then see how these actually work in reality, and also what is feasible in terms of like what could work for companies to use.
Great, thanks a lot, Nicholas, and thanks a lot. And our next respondent is Remco Faas from Eneco, a supplier. So Remco, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, and not only a supplier, but also a producer of renewable energy. We are active in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and the UK. So those people living in those countries probably know our name. And I work on the Eneco Energy Trade Department, and from there involved in projects for energy tax, also in the granular certificate area. However, I think it's nice to state that the discussions on 24/7 with us started a couple of years ago. I think 2014, I remember well, with the Dutch Railways closing the big corporate PPA with us, and had to answer questions. Okay, 100% green on an annual basis. How does it work if I take the train in the morning and the wind is not blowing at all? And answering those questions was always hard to us, and amongst us also our customers. So the questions at that time started, and I must say that at the time every renewable production unit in the grid was welcomed. We come to a time that we have overproduction of renewables, and then 24/7 matters. So we are absolutely happy to see your study here, and we see it also as and encouraging the industry and corporates to think about the 24/7 sourcing. I think I should also state that where we are in the moment in the market is a difficult time. We have an energy crisis, security of supply problems, and absolutely increasing cost. At the same time, we see that every crisis comes with opportunities, and also here, fossil free is now really the pathway to follow. In that, I think it's clear that we still rely heavily on flex systems in the grid, which are by far not CO2 free. So gas plants do that, and it's not lifted out in the system and incentivized. So therefore, we think that make it transparent to customers. It's absolutely crucial that they awareness start that they never can become CO2 free in the way we live now, because for flex we simply don't have assets available which are CO2 free. And to come back on your research, I'm absolutely happy that you made an outlook to 2030 and plugged in new technologies, including cost. Customers would like to think about 24/7 being free of carbon, but the uncertainty on what technologies are available and what are cost is really a difficult one to deal with. So I think that we were very happy to see that in the report, and I think that's the job to do, of course, develop those assets. We will do that. We all need to do that. On that I have many questions. How do those technologies work? How flexible are they? And that's the big unknown to me as well. But what I found a surprise in the report is that you seem to have a little bit more optimistic view than I thought first instance to reach 95% matching at relative same cost. And that would be fantastic because it is a kind of threshold for customers who are sitting now on an annual 100% green story to their customers, and that need to come back. And that's a difficult one. And our calculations shows, and it's probably for the Netherlands different than for other countries, that 95% is already quite costly and difficult to achieve. So that was a big surprise. But it could also be that it has to do because of over procurement, which is more or less allowed. And over procurement is what I would define, you buy more energy on an annual basis than you would need. So you see that in the graphs from the slide on Google, you have sometimes a surplus and selling it back to the market. And in your cost analysis, you assume that you get some income for that. I think it's crucial, what is that income? Because typical oversupply comes in a moment when there is oversupply in the system as well, and prices are negative or zero. Is it realistic to think that because if you have income, that presses, of course, the cost to come to the 95%, or if that 85% in another country. I would be keen on understanding that better, whether that's not too optimistic.
Great, thanks, Remco. Maybe just to speak to that last point. So the model models the electricity prices on an hourly basis internally. So they'll be getting a simulation of what those electricity prices are when they sell back. So when there's an oversupply of renewables, they will see their prices, but they may also be feeding in at sort of shoulder times when the prices are a little bit higher. So that's part of the reason. We're also comparing it not directly to the 100% renewable energy procurement cost, but we're also including the costs of actually supplying the electricity for those hours when the renewables isn't available. So that makes the 100% RES a bit more expensive than maybe what you typically compare it to. So for fairness, we wanted to compare it basically as a supply contract, so that we have comparing apples with apples. That may make the 100% annual renewables a bit more expensive. So that could be contributing towards it, but we're happy to sit down with you and look at the assumptions and do some comparisons there. We have to look in the Netherlands case as well, whether it's really 95% or whether 90 or 85 that's more reasonable on that basis. I had one more question to you, though. I was thinking, how much demand do you actually see from potential customers? Are they coming to you looking for these types of products, and what kind of targets are they really aiming for? Are they aiming for 80, 90, and what is it looking like from your perspective?
Yeah, such typical 24/7 demand potentially comes from corporate customers, corporate. I call that corporate and industrials, less from households because this is a quite complicated way of sourcing. And of that group, I would not at this stage be too optimistic of the size of the group. It's for reasons probably that Google supported you this. I see the tech sector really as frontrunners in this area at the moment. I think for reasons they have a quite additional demand in the system, and for them difficult to claim or to enter that system without thinking about how to source it. Good followers are already there that are public bodies thinking about their responsibility of 24/7 sourcing. But honestly, the major chunk of corporates and industrials are sitting on corporate, anyways, the corporate PPA with 100% demand. And you should be realized that just a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, most of those customers were sitting on gray. So there's already a big move for them to think about sourcing geos and think about this. And I think it is a matter of years, maybe even less than 2-3 years, when they also will switch. And what definitely helps is that we have frontrunners here active and studies like this. And of course, within 1-2-3 years, we have moments of oversupply. And in a market like we are now, I'm absolutely convinced that 24/7 will be around 25, more common than now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that staging over time is really important, because this 100% renewable procurement, I think, really made sense over the last 20 years, because the systems are relatively dirty and there's so much you can achieve just by adding renewable energy to the system. But it's really when you get towards 2025, but particularly 2030, where the hourly approach really helps the system and helps the emissions, because of that feed in during those difficult periods, and not overstuffing the systems when there's already plenty of wind and solar generation anyway. So I think we have to see it as a sort of maturation and progression over the last 20 years that's pushing this forward and making it more relevant. So thank you very much, Remco. Our next respondent is Bruce Douglas from Eurelectric, and he has some slides to share, which I will just share on
Sure.
my side.
Sorry, thanks a lot, Tom. I mean, just before I go into the slides, I mean, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting us to be on this panel. And yourself and Igor should be congratulated for this study. It's really timely. It mirrors what was done previously in the US by Princeton. And maybe before I go into the slides, maybe some takeaways that I see that are important from that. The first is following on from what yourself and Remco just mentioned about it being a journey, you know, and it's inevitable that this will happen, but it's a long-term journey. And I think the first really important and clear finding is that all energy consumers, CNI, public, are already on that journey. So they already have a CFE score. It could be anything between 40 and 80%, as you show in the study, depending on what their procurement strategy is and where their load is located. So that's a really important note. So corporates can already benchmark themselves, get a baseline CFE score to see where they are, and that gives visibility on where they can go. You know, the benefits are huge in terms of transparency and confidence for those corporate energy buyers. The second is that cost comparison issue, and again, Remco mentioned it. You know, up to 90%, it's CFE, it's cost comparable with 100% annual matching, but brings significant benefits in terms of accelerated carbon emission reductions. The third is about the carbon emission reductions, and I think there I've got so many questions for you, Tom. Maybe we'll have to have a bilateral on this. This report really opens up, you know, a plethora of ideas and questions on that. It would be great to see, you know, the total CO2 reduction potential over the long term. You know, going beyond the 25%. What if all RE100, you know, members were at a certain percentage of CFE? The other would be to see a cost per CO2 graph. You know, you would basically overlap the cost and the CO2 graph to see, you know, and what's interesting is, maybe this is another takeaway, is the impact is different per zone, per market, per country. And so, you know, on a market where there's already low carbon intensity, you know, the impact is different to one where there's high carbon intensity. So it'd be great to see the cost per ton. You know, and again, that helps corporates decide where to locate, where to spend, and so on. Just to run through our slides, I mean, Eurelectric is a body. We represent 3,000 companies across the power sector, from generation through distribution and end-use consumption of electricity. And based on, you know, what we see and what's just been discussed, you know, the inevitability of this 24/7, our members are super interested in. Many of our utility supply companies have a commercial offering in this space. And we've created this hub. It's online. You can scan the QR code. I'll put the link in the chat as well. With these partners here, including Energy Tag. I see Killian's on the call, and RE100. If you go to the next slide, you see, you know, why hourly matching is important. This is taken from Energy Tag. Many of those things you mentioned in your report, Tom. But just to go back to Killian raised in the chat about, you know, you were comparing with the best case scenario of annual matching. And it would be great to see, you know, what an average RE100 member, because in Europe, I think it's 84% of RE100 members are meeting their 100% annual matching commitments with unbundled guarantees of origin and green tariffs, which, you know, as you mentioned, has limited or no impact on carbon emission reductions. So it'd be great to see, you know, the catastrophic case versus, you know, a CFE case. I think that's probably more real. Here you see, you know, the advantages of moving towards granular certificates, increased transparency, clear energy price, and so on. You mentioned many of them. If you go to the next slide, as I say, it's a journey, and it can be done in parallel to the 100% annual matching journey. And you know, there's some comparisons it shows in your report as well. And the next slide, in this hub, we have you know, a lot of members from a lot of different sectors. That's just a selection of them. The final slide is what we're planning to do over the coming years, is really create this ecosystem. So it's to map, coordinate, and align the stakeholders in Europe on this. Of course, it can be internationalized. And this is, you know, the funnel, if you like, the journey that we want to take. So, you know, as many corporate buyers as possible in at that left-hand end to educate and raise awareness about this topic, show what the benefits are. So that's the what and the why. Next, and this can be done in parallel, is the policymakers. Absolutely critical to make sure that the legislative frameworks are in place to facilitate 24/7 hourly matching. And on that, specifically in Europe, there's two really important pieces to note. One is on the voluntary granular certificates. I saw a question in the chat about why don't we make it mandatory? A mandatory, you know, 85, 95% CFB for all corporates. We, you know, obviously we'd love that. It's unrealistic. And even getting the voluntary granular certificates is not a done deal. It's being currently discussed in the trialogues at the European institutions. We're hoping that voluntary certificates will be in place to allow this to happen in Europe. So voluntary guarantees of origin. And the second piece is on green hydrogen. And there again, you know, the Parliament voted not in favor of this delegated act on green hydrogen and the criteria within it. And, you know, it's really important to have a delegated act to accelerate green hydrogen, and in there have a criteria which stipulates hourly matching of clean and renewable energy to make sure that that green hydrogen is actually green. Otherwise, you will have consequences in terms of increased emissions on that. So we're lobbying heavily on that. The third is technical training, and we delighted to be working with FlexiDAO. Just 2 weeks ago in Amsterdam, we did an academy with them. So a training course. We have over 60 large energy buyers in the room for 3 hours. Again, going through the how to do this. The final piece on implementation is the hardest, of course, you know, signing contracts. How do we get that done? We've got quite a few initiatives going on there to make sure that, you know, we make it as simple as possible and allow buyers to take that next step. As I say, Tom, loads of questions from my side, but a fascinating report. And, you know, for us within this hub, it's super valuable. So thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Bruce, for those comments and questions. Just to speak to some of the questions, there would obviously be a bigger impact if more people are doing it. That's clear. So we compare the 10% to 25% in the report, and that trend would continue and may saturate as more and more people do it. We'd have to look into that. The question about the cost of going that extra mile to hourly over annual versus the emissions reduction, well, generally that doesn't tend to look terribly good for these kind of studies. So those extra tons of carbon that you avoid comes at a relatively high cost, because we already have a carbon price in the system, so all of that's already used up. In 2030, we have a carbon price of 130 from the ETS, and going further than that with the hourly puts you up into the 200 to 300 range in terms of the marginal abatement cost. So it's not the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions in the system. That would probably be taking your wind and solar and putting it into a more dirty system like Poland. But the benefit of the system is it's transparent. We're really attributing our energy consumption to our demand. So it's a clear attribution pathway, and we're accelerating the technology development and sending those signals for more storage, more demand-side management, and more advanced technologies as well. So I think it's this trade-off between, you know, cost-effective emissions reduction versus the technologies that the system needs, and this is definitely more on the technology the system needs side, but it is also reducing emissions for the buyer in the system as well. So there is some sort of trade-off there between like the most cost-effective way of doing the emissions reduction and supporting the technologies that we need. I'm glad you mentioned hydrogen, because it's also partly related. Hydrogen, depending on the market structure, could see a very similar story where if you have an offtake price, guaranteed offtake price, we have seen some initial simulations that there is a benefit for emissions reduction for going hourly versus annual. So that discussion is going along in parallel to this 24/7 C&E side. You mentioned a couple of the challenges and the implementation. Maybe for a question for you, Bruce, is where's the biggest challenge? You speak to a lot of people on all sides, buyer and supplier side. Where do you see the biggest bottlenecks here? Where should the policymakers also focus over the next couple of years?
Okay, so that's two groups. I mean, definitely the buyers, it's awareness. It's about, you know, your report is just, like I say, so timely and valuable for that. At this academy we held 2 weeks ago, there's 60 energy buyers. We did an exit poll saying, are you more or less likely to now investigate 24/7 after being, you know, in this 3-hour discussion? And it was like 7 out of 10, you know, so moving towards, yeah, they're willing to look into it, investigate it. So it's very early days, let's be honest. It's a niche market currently, it's growing, it will be inevitable. But we need to raise awareness and educate buyers. Actually, the same for the policymakers as well. But just for the policymakers, the message is just let us do it. Yeah, just don't prevent it by, you know, by putting in legislation that could stop it. To just allow it to happen voluntarily. You know, we're not asking for mandate, voluntarily, and then it will happen.
And does that coincide with what you've been seeing, Nicolas and Remco? I mean, Nicolas, you spoke a bit to the problems of standardization and data usage. I mean, do you see the technical side being the bottleneck, or is it more on the policymaker side, having the right regulations to support 24/7 and other hourly matching processes?
I think actually we have bottlenecks on both sides currently, but yeah, policy is probably more important currently, because if there is no policy on it, then people won't get started on developing solutions. And yeah, for solving the IT issues, you need people solving or developing solutions in order to figure out what are actually the biggest issues here.
And how does it look from your perspective, Remco?
Yeah, I see both as well. I see the voluntary demand I spoke in, as I mentioned here in this presentation. I did not mention the that this is a tool for the policy, for politics to incentivize. And a nice thing, we did a pilot last year with another data center company in the Netherlands, together with the issuing body CETQ. And this was found by the Dutch Parliament, and they raised questions to our government: how can we use 24/7 certificates to stimulate renewables? And in the opinion of Eneco, we see good area in the heat industry for e-boilers to connect electricity production, and that these are these days subsidy free, and to use it for producing heat where there's still a subsidy granted. And not to forget, we all know the EU discussion, I think was mentioned, you had a delegated act, by the way, I think not going in the promising direction, but the early proposals was also including a 24/7 matching. So I think, yeah, voluntary demand and in politics, both.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our respondents. We're at the top of the hour, but I would like to just finish by answering the remaining questions in the chat. Somebody asks about calculation of the local carbon intensity, the actual consumed electricity and the electricity bought from the market perspective. So we are definitely focused a little bit more on the market side because it's markets that we're modeling, but we are taking into account both what's going on in the local bidding zone and the imports into the bidding zone. So the actual physical tracking of the electrons is, of course, a bit more difficult. It's hard to do that in a kind of unique way. There are various algorithms for it, but it's something that could be looked at in parallel, really tracing the electricity through the system. We're modeling the bidding zones. We're not modeling we're modeling the interconnectors between the bidding zones, but not the actual grid inside the countries and inside the bidding zones. But that is something that we plan to look at in the next part of the project. Somebody asks about the emissions of manufacturing, the various technologies, the generators and the storage, and no, we haven't included those in the analysis. We're just focusing on the direct emissions from running the assets. So it's not including the LCA analysis, but of course, as we decarbonize the system, we expect that all the industrial processes that go into the cement and the steel of the plant is also decarbonized. So that would be in parallel happening in the background to reduce those emissions from manufacturing. Somebody asked about the differences between bundled and unbundled energy attribute certificates. is there a benefit of unbundled or spot purchasing? I'm not 100% sure I have a good answer to that question. I would try and have them bundled where possible, but if not, wherever there's trading and arbitrage opportunities between companies would want to use those. I don't have a very good feeling on that. Does anyone from the panel want to answer, Remco?
Yeah, no, so same here. I'm not certain about what is meant with the difference between bundled and unbundled. Is it possible to speak out, or should we make a guess? Because if it is about, let's say the problem with the 24/7 certificates is that you get micro, 15-minute certificates or hourly certificates. The trading becomes more complicated. If it's that about, then yeah, that is a challenge. But I'm not so sure whether that is meant with this.
Michael, do you want to speak out?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Brown. This is Michael McRae with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The question is trying to understand relative to today's accounting framework, where we allow the use of unbundled certificates sold without any sort of excuse me, I had to sneeze, any sort of long-term contract. And so all these certificates are trading on sort of an annual or yearly, monthly basis. So it's really differentiating between a long-term PPA acquisition of RECs and a developer generating resource that builds their project without such contract and simply sells those energy attribute certificates into the open market. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, to me at least. Yeah, I think that is, let's say, the job we do as a trading organization, that we provide long-term contracts and on which the developers can build. So providing them a fixed income. And what we do is we take the risks of let's say, the not matching demand with the production unit. Because there's always a role for an intermediate party to flatten it out, because what do you call that? The interests of both parties are completely different and quite often not matching the interest of the buyer and the interest of a producer. So I think, I think that there should always be a party taking away risks here. And does that answer your question?
That's helpful. I think there's a lot more room to model these types of scenarios in a tool like this. I'm candidly very excited to see this type of modeling horsepower brought to bear on these questions. But I think as a potential next modeling step, that type of scenario would be really helpful. But the answer that you just provided was also very helpful as well. So thank everybody for this informative panel, at least this morning for me, but probably afternoon for many others.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, where I'm just a bit unsure is that one wants to push bundled wherever possible, but if one's having some sort of residual hourly certificates that are in excess somehow, there may be benefits from allowing them to be traded unbundled as well. That's why I'm a bit unsure. So I was being a bit sort of nervous around the question.
Yeah, I mean, what I understand is commercial operators such as FlexiDAO. From what I understand, they do facilitate that, the unbundled granular certificates. So that's to be seen. I mean, as this market develops. But yeah, it's certainly something to keep an eye on. Thanks, Michael.
So just through the rest of the questions, somebody asks how relevant are these findings if you exclude 50% of the demand, which will have to be met 95. Actually not 100% sure what that question means. Maybe the person, Philip, you could just restate the question. It's a bit unclear to me. Michael asks about the opportunities to include information on avoided emissions based on displacement of marginal generating resources. Well, I don't know if you asked that question. I mean, we did look at the study at the system emissions. We do look at the avoided emissions in the system based on that displacement of the marginal generating resources. So that is there in the model, the system emissions that are displaced by the hourly procurement. Somebody asks, did we take into account low yield renewable technologies such as low wind turbines or non-self-facing solar? No, we did not take that into account. That's something that we could add into the technology mix. And the question of the data center flexibility is something we also want to look at in the next stage of the project as well. So just to give you a feeling, we're 6 months into a 2-year project. This is a sort of first show of the results. We're going to be developing the model further to look in particular at demand side management for Google's data centers, and not just shifting things by a few hours, but shifting jobs, say, from Scandinavia to Ireland, depending on the wind conditions. And that offers huge flexibility that also can deal with these very difficult periods where you have the wind blowing somewhere and not somewhere else. You can move then the compute jobs across the continent. And that offers, I think, really a huge amount of flexibility, not just in time, but also in space. So that is something that we'll be looking at in the future. And I think that leaves us a nice point to also round up. We've seen some initial results from our study that show a very positive picture for going towards hourly 24/7. We see that we benefit not just the buyer, but also the whole system in terms of emissions and flexibility requirements. The cost premiums there are depending a bit on the technology mix, but even with existing technology, definitely targets in the range of 90% are looking feasible and cost effective, with the remaining 10% to be seen on the technology availability. But definitely by bringing these concepts into the market, we're creating those extra incentives to investigate all the different strategies and the supply and the demand side for meeting those, not without, of course, their regulatory and technical complexities, as we've heard from our respondents, but very positive picture all the same. So just to wrap up, I want to thank again our respondents, Nicholas, Remco, Bruce, for taking the time to come on and share their opinions with us. Thank you very much to the 3 of you. Thank you to my colleague Igor Ripin, who did most of the study actually, and has been in the background in case there were any technical questions. So thank you, Igor, and thank you again to Google for sponsoring the project. We look forward to lots of future results in the future and a continuation of the discussion. So thanks everybody. Thanks also for the questions, and that marks the end of the event. So thank you. Great, and we will stay in the room. Thanks a lot, Bruce and Remco and Nicholas, and thanks a lot for your time. Hope to see you in presence sometime at a conference soon. Happy to stick on at the end if anyone wants to say anything more in the chat or address or thinks. Is there anything you think we didn't address today, Remco and Bruce?
Sorry, yeah, sorry. What did you ask?
Is there anything that you think we didn't address today in the webinar that we should have done?
No, it was completely quite complete. Yeah, it was the question about the grid mix, probably also coming back with the marginal generating resources on the end. That was also I think one my colleague Rory also flagged out to you that keeps me questioning all the time. How should we deal with that? So 24/7 matching is fantastic, but makes it very complicated on that part. I flagged it up in the energy tech working groups as well. And if we can come to a residual mix or something like that, then the circle's round again. But that's, I think, a very big challenge we have there.
I think that's actually a good point. And there's 1 or 2 things I wanted to say to that I should have said, but the recording's still on, so it's there for posterity. Calculating this grid mix, once we've taken out the generation that's already spoken for and already has certificates somewhere cancelled for, it's a data intensive and difficult exercise, so it does need a bit more work. The other thing I would say is that when we actually rely on the grid for those hourly CFE imports where we're using the grid, it's only really when we're in the 80 to 90% hourly range, and there I don't think the cost difference would be that different to actually just ignoring the grid CFE and focusing on the directly procured energy. And when we go above 90 to 100%, we have to rely on our procured assets anyway, because the grid isn't perfectly clean. So I think actually it doesn't really distort the picture too much what goes on in that area. But this is something I think we have to also have another look at as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I see the comment. Killian's still on, and he made that comment. I don't know if he can speak or not, but yeah, that's something they're looking at, energy tag, and we'd be very keen on exploring that further.
Yeah, I'm happy to bring Killian into the discussion if he wants to join.
Wow, hello.
Hi,
You can hear me? Hi,
yes.
Everyone. It was good. Thanks. Great panel, great session. Yeah, obviously the residual mix, it's something we're aware of, and we definitely need to have resolved right by the time this actually scales up. Otherwise, there's double counting. So yeah, very much aware of that and working with some of the experts who put together the residual mix already in Europe on an annual basis. The other thing I'd like to, I know it's been said before, but reiterate, because I have heard some folks misusing a little bit the results of studies like this to say that actually, 100% annual matching, it's kind of most of the way there. We need to be careful about that. Obviously, this is the best case of annual matching, that is with long-term PPAs, that is on a local grid. Most annual matching at the moment is not like that. So I think having actually a study, or I don't know if you're able to actually produce that already based on the results you have, Tom, of like, the typical RE100 buyer versus this 100% CFE strategy, so RE100 versus 100% CFE, that could be really powerful to just make it clear to folks, actually, here's today and here's tomorrow, because I don't think that nuance is understood by a lot of people.
No, that's a great suggestion, Killian, and that's popped, came out from this webinar actually. That I don't know if you can do it, Tom, but best case scenario, 100% annual match you've got here, a worst case, and a sort of average case, and it then shows corporates what the impact of their current procurement is approximately, and what they could do. In a comparison to CFE, it would be a really important graph.
Yeah, I think what you probably would have as a result is if you were, say, in Germany buying unbundled RECs from Norway, so you would have no impact basically. I think it would just be that simple. But we could sort of make that a bit clearer in the communication of the report. What I haven't really seen is data on what fraction in each country is taking unbundled RECs from which source. Like if we had a bit more data on sort of what percentage was unbundled RECs, what percentage in each country, then we could really do something a bit more quantitative there.
RE100, they have that. RE100 CDP have all that information. That's why I got that 84% in their annual report. Okay. They show publicly an aggregated figure, I think, for the whole of Europe, but they have that data for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Then I think.
And it's about the communication of it, because you have that graph actually. As you say, it's probably just the grid mix. If it's the German grid mix is that figure, but it's then that should be the 100% worst case annual matching. Is that even if you're
Yeah. No, I think that would be a good thing to include in the next iteration. Definitely.
And the technologies you plugged in as new for the 2030 outlook, that I stipulated that was new to me and of high interest. That is the uncertainty where we have to live. If you are now 70-80% match or 90% match, how broad is that study? Because I can imagine you have maybe other technologies, compressed air, and then green gas or whatever. And I think biomethane was popped up. I can imagine that this, let's say, the 24/7 matching, that is a difficult system modeling. But on the other hand, this is also a kind of a difficult question. What technologies do you have? What cost do you expect for 2030? How much time do you put on that research?
So what we did is try to have categories of technologies. So we're not trying to cover all the possible storage technologies or all the dispatchables, but to see what the effect is of having something like long duration storage.
Yeah.
Focus there being on the energy storage capacity cost, the euros per kilowatt hour being the thing that's really decisive there. So having something with low euros per kilowatt hour, Form Energy are also targeting, I think, is it $20 or $10 per kilowatt hour, and we're looking really at the effect of having a technology like that in the system, or a technology like the alum cycle, which is carbon free but has relatively high variable costs because we're using natural gas or the nuclear. So we try to think in terms of technology categories rather than the individual technologies, because their mix of capital and variable costs are the things that make the difference in the mix. And obviously, if something like geothermal comes in at a very, very low cost, then it'll kill everything. So it's that's also something that has to be clear. So these results depend strongly on the technology assumptions that go in there as well. Yeah. So we try to deal with this uncertainty by offering these different palettes with different technology combinations, just to show the span of results resulting from that uncertainty, and what actually is available in 2030. We'll have to see, but this at least covers the span.
No, I don't know how the others see that here in the call. We're still there, but I see that's a difficult part of the job, and that's why I think, first instance, our sales channels, dating back 5 years ago, we're not very happy with, let's say, us mathematicians looking at that, saying, "Hey, the truth is that you are not so green on an annual basis." Saying, "Yeah, I just told my customers they are 100% green." Okay, now, yeah, and if I tell my customers you go back to 60, 78, 80% green, then it's the big uncertainty. What does it cost to me to get back to 100%? I get back to 100%, and that uncertainty, that is, I think, an answer we need to answer, a question which we need to answer also now. So I think what you reflected, and that's why I liked it. Okay, it means that is very expensive, the last 5%. But how expensive will that, and how much will those costs reduce? I think that is a very. I will be really happy if I have more studies on that, saying what that will be. Yeah.
No, but you're right, Remco, and that's one of what we encountered when we had this academy. There were 60 buyers around the table. I mean, all of them, most of them were RE100 members, and we see that campaign, RE100, is hugely beneficial. I mean, almost like a gateway drug. Getting in on renewable procurement, because then they have to think about it and talk about it and start moving in that direction. But the difference between because it's percent, they think, oh, we're comparing like with like. Not at all. And so that's the communication we have to go through. Is like. And the word 24/7 also implies you're at 100%. 24/7 means 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, and it's not that, it's hourly matching, and you're on a journey towards 100% 24/7. And so that's the message we're trying to get across to people. Just by scoring yourself, getting a baseline, you've got visibility, transparency, and confidence in where you're at and where you could go. And I think that's the crucial step in terms of educating, communicating, and transitioning from one to the other. And also note that we're not trying to undermine anything to do with the existing procurement strategies or RE100. This can be done in parallel, and it'll take years. We're aware of that long-term transition. I just know that Andrew Glumac from CDP is actually on the call. He just asked a question about mixing the two, CFE contracted and CFE from the grid. So Tom, you can maybe answer that. But also, as he says in the chat, he's the guy with all the data that we were talking about earlier about that country-specific procurement strategies. So I don't know if, Tom, you want to answer that, or maybe unmute Andrew so you can.
I would maybe unmute Andrew if that's okay with him, or at least give him the opportunity to speak his question out loud. But I think it goes back to the discussion we were having about to what extent the energy attribute certificates are really bundled with the power, and to what extent we're mixing things in the mix in the grid mix that are coming from already spoken for electricity. And I think that there is a bit of a challenge. But I would go back to the point I was making, that I think actually if you are not forced to rely on the grid, it's not going to make a big difference to the overall picture, because at 80 to 90% you can get it with your directly contracted assets, and 90 to 100 you can't really rely on the grid anyway. So I think there's less of an issue there than it might seem.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, similar to what Killian said, I think for that methodology to really make sense, we need to understand where the residual mix that's being used is coming from. Is the other stuff, is the contracted energy being removed from it, and just a bit more transparency around how that's all being done.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. It'd be great if you could share some of that data with us as well. That's not in the. If there's anything that's not in the report that might help us to generate this sort of case study for the unbundled certificates.
Yeah, please get in touch. Data licenses and everything required. So I obviously can't just send over data.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Andrew.
Yep.
Great. Then I think we've covered all the questions, and we've had a good chat. And if it's okay with everybody, I would just put this whole recording, including this discussion afterwards onto the YouTube, unless anyone objects, and that will be there for future historians at 24/7 to look at to see what the state of discussion was in 2022. So thanks again, Bruce and Remco, and have a nice afternoon, everybody.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Ciao, take care.
Bye.